Hello everyone, welcome again to the Budding Watch Enthusiast. Today we are going to do the first of what's probably going to become a recurring segment where we take a look at some beginner concepts for newer watch collectors, people who are newer to this hobby that want to get to know more about wristwatches. One of the things that I kind of wanted this channel to be is sort of a destination for newer collectors and newer hobbyists to find out more about watches and check that out. So I think this will be a helpful tool. Today, for this first episode, we are going to be looking at something that I really didn't know a lot about when I first started getting into this hobby, and that is watch movements. And I think watch movements are something that is very important, especially something that you should be aware of whenever you're purchasing a watch, knowing what movement is in it, knowing the features of that movement. So today we're going to take a very rudimentary look at watch movements. Not really going to look at how watch movements work. There's some great YouTube videos that you can check out to see that, and you should definitely do that because I think that especially mechanical movements are one of those very cool inventions, just in how they work and how they're powered is a very cool bit of design that has stayed the course of time for the last almost 200 years at this point. So, but a very rudimentary look. We're going to be looking at the basic types of movements that are out there. We're going to be looking at some of the features that you should be looking for when purchasing a watch, and we're going to compare in-house movements versus mass-produced movements. So we'll take a look at all that. I will say that if you are someone who is already very familiar with watch movements, if you know what an ETA 2824 is, just by the name, probably not going to be a lot of new information in here for you. This is definitely going to be very much a beginner's look at this. Before we get too far down the road though, quick wristwatch check. I have my brand new Hamilton khaki field day-date automatic, which I just got a couple days ago. It's been on my wrist ever since. Really enjoying it so far. Look for a full review of that probably next episode, or next video that I put up. So keep an eye out for that one. But so far I've really been enjoying it. So let's get down to it. First of all, what is a watch movement? For those that don't even know what a watch movement is, a watch movement is essentially the engine of your watch. It is what makes your watch work. It is the thing, it is the mechanisms that are put together that make the hands move on your watch, which is what helps it tell the time, which is of course the primary function of the watch. It will also control any other complications that the watch might have as well. So it's kind of a big deal, like I said, to understand what movements are and what to look out for them. There are three basic types of watch movements. The first one is the one that probably most non-hobbyists would be the most familiar with, and those are quartz movements. Quartz movements are in probably the vast majority of watches that get made today, because these are the battery-powered movements that you find in, like I said, most small watches. Any digital watch, of course, will have a quartz movement. Most fashion watch brands also will have a quartz movement as well. So again, these are the movements that are battery powered, or in the case of like Citizen Echo Drive, can be power cell powered, and that power cell can be recharged with light, which means the watch will last as long as the power cell lasts. So those are different types of quartz movements as well. The key characteristics of those, besides the battery operations, the quartz movements tend to be the ones that are the most accurate and the most robust because they have fewer moving parts, because they have fewer things that can go wrong. They tend to be a little more robust, and the accuracy, because it's an electronic movement, because it's being battery powered, and that battery is giving off power at fixed intervals. Quartz movements don't tend to gain or lose very much time at all. On average, a quartz movement watch will gain or lose up to 10 seconds per month. That's about 1/3 of a second per day, which on a mechanical watch would be very, very good if it was able to keep that pace up very consistently. When we shift over to the mechanical side of things, there are two types of mechanical movements. The first one is a manual wind movement, and this is, as the name suggests, a watch movement that is powered by literally winding the watch, tightening the mainspring in the watch, which is basically the watch's battery, for lack of a better term rather. And those are manual movements rather, are what you found on most watches early on in the 20th century. For the first half of the 20th century, most wristwatches that did come out were manual wind movements. That did persist on later, but diminished a little bit more as automatic came into popularity. You can still find a few watches that come out nowadays that are exclusively manual wind, but it's much fewer and far between because they have, for the most part, been replaced with automatic movements. And the difference between those two is that an automatic movement will keep the watch powered, will keep that mainspring coiled with a rotor that is fixed on top of the movement. And as you move your arm, just through doing normal daily actions that you would normally do, that rotor will spin and will tighten that mainspring. And then the other benefit that automatics have is that with a manual wind, you can actually overwind the watch. If you wind it too much and you wind it to the point past where it can be the tightest, you can actually damage the watch. But automatic watches tend to have a clutch, because obviously you can't keep the rotor from spinning, so that clutch will keep the spring from being overwound once it is all the way tightened. So those are the two big differences. Like I said, automatics are what you're going to find in the vast majority of mechanical watch movements that you see nowadays. And typically that is the watch movement that is most popular amongst watch enthusiasts as well. So what are some features that you should look for when you're purchasing a watch that you want to kind of pay attention to as it relates to the watch movement? So the first thing that you might want to see, especially with a mechanical watch more so, is the power reserve. How long will the watch stay powered when not in use? And for a quartz watch, of course, since it's battery powered, most quartz watches are going to be, the batteries in them last for 2 to 3 years on average. If they have a lithium battery, it might last even longer. I mentioned the Citizen Echo Drive, and Seiko also has a solar powered movement as well. Those tend to last much longer because you're powering a power cell which is constantly being recharged. For a mechanical movement, on average, I would say most watch movements that are mechanical will last about 48 hours, so meaning you can go one full day without wearing the watch and it'll still continue to run. But after that, you might want to make sure that you charge it up if you want to make sure that it continues running. Otherwise, the next time you use the watch, you'll have to reset it basically and set it to the correct time and date that it needs at that point. So that's one thing you want to look at is power reserve. Now, there are many automatic watches that have even longer power reserves. It's not uncommon to see some higher end ones with a 72-hour reserve. Some super high end ones, like in the super luxury class, can even last as much as a week, which is very cool, I think, as well. The next thing you want to look at is vibrations per hour, and what this is indicative of a couple different things when you're looking at a watch movement. The vibrations per hour basically determines how many times the second hand is moving in an hour, essentially, for lack of a better term. Like I said, it's not actually what it is, but again, like I told you, I'm not going into a super deep dive, but vibrations per hour is essentially how many times the second hand is going to move every hour. So of course, for a quartz watch, those are typically fixed at about 3,600 vibrations per hour, which is why you get that very steady tick, tick, tick every second on a quartz watch. For automatics though, or for mechanical watches, they can vary a little bit. The two most popular that you'll see is 21,600 vibrations per hour or 28,800 vibrations per hour. There are some that do a little bit less. There are some, again, higher end ones that do a little bit more. But why does that matter? What difference does it make? The higher vibrations per hour the watch beats at, the smoother the second hand sweep will be that goes across the watch. So if you've ever seen, any automatic watches that have that very smooth, very steady sweep of the second hand, those are watches that typically are operating at a higher VPH than other watches are. The other thing that you have to look at with that too, though, is that typically higher VPH watches need to get serviced more frequently than lower VPH watches, just because there is more stress and more, you know, movement happening within the watch movement. So that's going to cause, you know, wear much quicker than a lower VPH movement will be. One of the reasons, like my Seiko SKX, for example, can go about 10 years before needing a service, because it operates at that lower 21,600 VPH frequency. So that's something you might want to look at as well, especially if you're looking to buy a luxury piece, because those service fees can tend to get a little bit more expensive. Complications is the next thing, and what is a complication? A complication is any feature that the watch has that is apart from it telling time. So things like a date window, a day window, a chronograph, a GMT hand, you know, things of that nature. Those are all complications. That is something that we'll go into more detail in a later video. But that's, of course, something that you need to look at as well. Typically, complications are something that you are going to be aware of going in, because a lot of times they're selling features of the watch is what complications are on the watch. But again, we'll take a much deeper dive at that in a video down the road at some point. The next thing you want to see is the watch movement hackable? Now, all Quartz movements are hackable. It's automatics that are going to typically variate, and what that means. So a hackable movement is one where when you pull the crown out of the watch, if the second hand stops completely, then the movement is hackable. If the second hand continues to move while the crown is pulled out, then it is not hackable. Why is that important? It's a helpful feature to have, especially if you want to be able to like set your watch to, you know, atomic time, so it's as accurate as can be, or if you're trying to synchronize your watch with something, a hackable movement is somewhat mandatory. Pretty much every military watch that's a mechanical watch is going to have a hackable movement, so again, you can get that synchronized time set up and ready to rock and roll. So but that's definitely something you want to see. Typically lower end mechanical movements are going to not be hackable, and typically anything that's even like, you know, just above low end movements are more than not, or often than not, going to be hackable, but it's still something that you'd like to know. If the watch has a date window, does it have a quick date adjustment? This is something that I always like to know going in, because if it does not, oh man, can that be a huge pain in the butt. And what a quick date adjustment is a watch that has a quick date adjustment will usually have a crown with three positions. You have the pushed in position, which is where the watch is operating, and then the pulled all the way out position, which is the position that you use to set the time. But then there'll be a third position that is in between those two, where you can spin the crown and quickly adjust the date or the day if the watch has that feature as well. Again, watches that don't have it are so annoying if you don't use them for a while, because you have to sit there and wind the time and scroll it until you can just pass day by day by day. I have a Timex Mercury, which is very small with a very tiny crown, and it is super, super annoying to not be able to adjust that date quickly. So I always like to know if it has a quick date adjustment for sure. And then the biggest thing that you want to see, and this is probably the most important thing, especially, well, I mean, almost exclusively for mechanical movements, is how accurate is the watch. Like I mentioned with Quartz watches, they're going to be the most accurate because of they're electronically powered. With a mechanical movement, you have to, you want to see like how much time does the watch typically gain or lose, because that can be a great measure of how the watch is performing. And if you have an issue with the watch as well, if that's something that you measure semi-regularly, most mechanical watches will gain or lose anywhere between 10 seconds per day, which is very normal. Most people consider anything within 30 seconds a day to be an acceptable range. But for anything beyond that, you might definitely have an issue with your watch, or just a really poor watch movement. Your higher end luxury watches, so like your Rolexes and your Omegas and stuff like that, they come with a special certification that is done by, I believe, part of the Swiss government, if I'm not mistaken. And their movements are required to stay within a range. I think it goes anywhere from -6 to +4 seconds per day, and they have to fall within that range in order to get this certification. So those are typically the most accurate movements you'll find is on higher end watches. So like my Seiko SKX, for example, very popular entry level brand or entry level model watch. It usually gains like 7 seconds per day, which is totally fine. And that's typical of what you'll see on most mechanical watches. So the last thing I wanted to look at today is what is the difference between mass-produced watch movements and in-house designed watch movements. Mass-produced movements are typically, again, what you'll find most of the time out there. And this can range, if you're looking at it in a pejorative way, like Chinese mass-produced movements that you find in a lot of fashion watches they'll tell the time, but they're not very, they're not good for much else, and you might have a lot of issues with them. But for my purposes, I'm thinking more of movements like the Miyota 9015 that Citizen puts out, or any ETA or ETA movement that comes out. ETA, for example, is a company that exclusively designs and manufactures watch movements that they then outsource to watch companies, so that the watch company doesn't have to worry about making a movement at all. And so you'll see a lot of, especially in that mid-tier, we're talking like $400 to $2,000 range, Swiss watches come with an ETA movement. I think it's something like 53, or I know it's over 50% of Swiss watches ship with an ETA movement inside of them. And you may think, well, that's kind of, cruddy to have this mass-produced movement, but the big benefit that mass-produced movements have is the fact that it's a very common movement, so watch repair places will know how to work with it because they see it in a lot of watches. Parts will be easily found for it for a long time because, again, it's a movement that's used in thousands upon thousands upon thousands upon, or probably millions of watches, more so. But of course, the downside is that you don't get a movement that's specifically designed for the watch that you're wearing, and B, you lose a little. They're not going to be the best performing movements. And don't get me wrong, ETA movements are very, very good. My Sal Baltimore watch also has a Miyota 9015, which is another very popular mass-produced movement that comes from the Citizen group in Japan. That has also been a very good movement. They're very robust, they're very good, but it's not quite the same as having an in-house movement, especially like a luxury in-house movement from a company. There is a level of uniqueness that is lost with a mass-produced movement. Conversely, an in-house movement is one that is designed and typically assembled, sometimes manufactured, by the watchmaking company itself. And this is something that you'll find in any luxury watch brand, pretty much. I'm struggling to think of too many luxury brands that don't have their own in-house movement for at least the majority of their models. So an in-house movement, again, typically it's designed by the company. It is always assembled by the company. Manufactured by the company? Sometimes not. Like Rolex, for example, will get parts from mass-produced places from China, but they will assemble the movements in-house themselves. So some people split hairs with that. Some people say, oh, that's not really an in-house movement if you're getting parts from China. Of course, the super high-end luxury brands, they all make their own parts typically. I'm not going to split hairs on that. If you're assembling the movement, every single watch movement in-house, it's an in-house movement. And the benefit that these come with is that they do give the watch a little bit more sense of uniqueness. They're designed from the ground up by the company, so they're going to perform the way that the watch company wants them to perform. When you are, if you're buying a Omega Speedmaster, you're getting that Omega coaxial movement. That is one of the reasons that people buy that watch, is for that watch movement, which is a very cool piece of technology, for sure. Usually you also get nicer finishing on these movements since they are assembled in-house, and again, since a lot of times the parts themselves are manufactured, you will get some much fancier finishing, especially if your watch has a nice exhibition back. You can really see some very nice stuff out there. And again, if we're talking like the super luxury brands, you can really, really get some very fancy looking movements that look very, very cool on the watch. On the flip side though, they're going to cost a lot more to repair. When you buy like a luxury watch, one of the things that you have to factor in to that price point, it's not just spending, $6,000 on a Rolex Explorer, it's $6,000 on a Rolex Explorer, and oh, it's probably going to cost $500 in 10 years to repair it because it's going to need to come in and get serviced at some point. So because you have to go to an authorized Rolex repair place to get it fixed, you can't just go to your corner watch shop and expect them to fix that movement and repair it to the precision that Rolex requires. So again, in-house movements, they're going to be more expensive typically to repair. That's not always the case though. Seiko, for example, is a company that makes their own movements for all of their watches, and their watches, of course, a lot of their watches are very affordable. And getting a Seiko 7S26 movement is not going to cost a lot to repair. You can usually get that done at most places. So when I say high repair costs, we're typically talking luxury brands. But there are some people that also, like I said, they don't necessarily. Some people will lump Rolex in, and they'll lump Seiko in with that mass-produced crowd. And certainly, Seiko, Rolex, Omega, like those companies are making millions of those watch movements every single year. They're putting them in millions of watches. So yeah, there is some level of mass production with them that you'll find. But again, for my money, if the movement's designed by the company and if it's being assembled by the company, it's an in-house movement, and that's what I would consider it. So hopefully you guys learned a little bit more about watch movements today, and hopefully next time you go to purchase a watch, you'll take a look at some of those things, you'll take a look at those features, and you'll have a little bit more knowledge so that you can make a more informed decision, which is really the whole point of this video here, is just to give you that knowledge and maybe to educate you a little bit more and maybe give you some trivial knowledge as well. Who knows? It depends on what you're here for. I really appreciate you guys watching this video. If you can, do me a huge help and hit the subscribe button, which you can see in the bottom right-hand corner right over here. Hit subscribe, that way you'll have these new episodes in your feed. If you also click that little bell icon down there, you'll be notified whenever new episodes come up. It helps me out a lot to do it, and if you enjoy the content that I'm putting out, again, please go ahead and hit that subscribe button. I would really appreciate it. Again, thank you all very much for watching, and I will see you next time.